Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I'm a spelunker, not really a professional one per se, but I pride myself on being professional and having the know-how to stay safe underground. My main exploration area is Colorado and Utah, and I went with a few buddies to a privately owned mine that the owner wanted explored and mapped out. We jumped at the chance to go and explore this one, and the guy offered us $400 to do the job, but we declined and did it for free since we got to explore the unexplored. We first did some research on the place to see if there was any mention of anything. The only hit we got on it was that there was an explosion that killed 56 miners, and the secondary cave-in afterward killed 3 rescue members who were trying to help. All the bodies were recovered, the collapsed area sealed off, and work resumed until around 1922, when funding ran out and they couldn't afford to haul the ore out, thus shutting down the mine. We notified a few buddies of the local fire department's mine rescue unit to come along to help us out. We set a date and immediately began getting things ready. Arriving there, we found it to be quite eerie. With no wind or natural sounds, all we could hear coming from the mine itself was the drip of water and the whisper of wind coming from the tunnel. Donning our waders, safety gear, and helmets, we turned on our flashlights and headed inside to see about the stability of the mine itself. Everything, including the wood, was in good condition. We didn't see any fractured areas on the roof of the tunnel, which would indicate a possible safety hazard. Tested the air and gases inside the mine, and it tested normal. The only issue we had was that everyone reported while being inside tunnel number 3 was that they were being watched. Work continued as we ventured further and further into the adjoining tunnels, and even into a few lower levels. We continued on one shaft until we reached the final blast point at 900 feet. Some winzes were flooded, and others led to drop-offs that, when measured, they reached almost 200 feet down. I was taking pictures for reference points when I spotted something down about 20 feet from where I set up my camera. Notifying the guy at the entrance to the tunnel, who was our safety man, I ventured down to investigate. The tunnel made a sharp turn to the right and then down at a 10-degree angle into darkness. Being the adventure lover I am, I decided to take a look. When I first stepped foot off of the incline, I felt not just in my body, but I felt it in the air around me that something wasn't right. It was as if there was something in my head screaming, "WTF, you doing anon?" I noticed a flickering of light down the tunnel and a little to the left. Shining my spotlight down there, it showed that the tunnel ventured left as well. Step by step, I ventured further, and each time my mind was screaming at me to turn back. Ignoring it, I worked up the courage to peer around the corner to find the source of the flickering light. When I reached the corner, my body was shaking, but I peered anyway, and I just saw blackness. My helmet lamp just showed the rusted tracks twisting away into darkness. My curiosity piqued, I decided to follow, testing the wooden rail supports before I stepped on them in case they were false floors or unstable. My spotlight and headlamp did nothing to the darkness, as it felt as if it was a blanket, and my lamps were nothing but pinpricks of light. I reached a junction about 40 feet from the left curve. One went up at 30 degrees, while the other one went down lower at another 10-degree angle. By this point, the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck were standing up, and my brain was screaming, "Red alert! Danger, Will Robinson!" Since all my climbing equipment was back with the safety man, I didn't dare climb up the left one, but I peeked out to snap a picture and turned to the right one to take a look further. It was at this point that something didn't feel right, and I just stared into the tunnel illuminated by my spotlight for a minute or two. In this trance-like state, I watched a shadow peer from an alcove, stare back at me and duck back away, then a deep rumbling growl like the mountain was shuddering. Freaking out that I might be caught in a cave-in, I turned around and was met by blinding light from a head-mounted lamp. 2 strong arms grabbed my shoulders and dragged me away from the junction, while a husky voice whispered in my head, "Come on, we gotta get out of here." When I reached the incline where I first climbed down from, the weight lifted off my shoulders and the voice said, "I'll catch up. Have to go back to check for others," as the light faded away down the tunnel again. Scrambling back up the incline, I motioned for the safety guy and several others by flashing a red backup light several times. When they arrived, I told them somebody else was down there, and that they dragged me out. We immediately took off together down the tunnel again to search for this mysterious man. When we reached the left turning area, all our lamps and spotlights went out and wouldn't turn on again, so we had to carefully make our way back up the incline in total darkness. All the while we heard clangs, screeching, and that rumbling coming from down the tunnel where I was dragged from. Never again did we go down there. We closed it up and put in red and white paint. Danger, unstable. I'll never know what exactly went on down there or who it was, but the rest of the time we were there, every time we passed that section, our hairs stood on end. That's my story.
I was on a teen camp expedition in Alberta, Canada to splunk some local caves, when we decided to move off the beaten path and search another cave. It was very tight, we had to literally force ourselves inside. Once we got in, we walked through the cave for about 1 kilometer until we reached the end where there was a flat wall. At the base of the wall, and up a steep slope, there was a 1 meter by 1 meter approximately hole in the wall. I was the skinniest, so I volunteered to investigate. I put on the camp leader's headlamp and got onto my stomach and entered the hole, not able to move my hands more than 15 degrees to the side, and edged my whole body in with my feet. As soon as I got into that hole, I felt a presence watching me. Being a young lad, I ignored it and kept crawling into the hole. I traveled around 3 meters into the hole until there was a sharp left-hand turn. I shone my headlamp down the tunnel to the end and saw a pile of sticks and leaves in a dead end. I went in to take a look, still not able to move my body more than an inch in any direction except for forward. I picked up one of the sticks and realized that it was a human bone. At that moment, without telling anyone what I had seen, someone outside let out an absolutely blood-curdling scream. I backed out of the hole as fast as I could, and my head hit the roof of the cave, turning the lamp off. As soon as the lamp turned out, I saw 2 glowing eyes staring directly into my face. Instantly, 2 hands grabbed my ankles and yanked me out of the hole. We ran. The camp lady would not tell anyone what she had seen, and neither did I, because I didn't want everyone to think I was crazy.
I was living near Eldridge, Missouri, and was raised in the general area and knew the terrain fairly well. I had spent time at the U.S. Army Engineer School in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and some of the training included spelunking. When I left the Army, I continued to explore caves as recreation. In 1993, I helped form a local group of experienced cavers. We would get together on weekends and explore some of the cavern systems throughout Missouri and Arkansas. The experience I am about to describe took place in the summer of 1995. I was on my own that day, which was not uncommon. I had decided to check out a cave in Camden County, Missouri, which was part of a fairly large system in the area. From what I could tell, this particular cave had not been explored for a long period of time. The entrance was very narrow and well hidden. After squeezing through the opening, I descended another 50 feet or so before the cave began to open up into a series of chambers. I moved through several of these chambers, taking my time to examine the area for possible artifacts and formations. I finally reached what I thought was the end of the cave. I started to hear a rustling sound that was echoing from a small opening near the top of the chamber. I assumed the sounds were bats and didn't pay much attention to it, but after a while I heard motorized sounds and talking. I stood and listened for several minutes, wondering what was on the other side of this chamber. The opening was about 10 feet above me. I maneuvered my way up to the opening, which was flat and narrow, but big enough for me to get a decent look into it. As I positioned myself to the front of the opening, I started to see light at the other end. The passageway was only a few feet long, but it was just too narrow for me to move through. As I looked through the opening, there was a very warm draft of air hitting my face. As well, the air had a very acrid vinegar-like odor. There was a very large and well-lit room with limestone walls. I noticed a small vehicle that looked like a golf cart, but was very low to the ground and without wheels. I continued to observe until I started to hear voices that were getting louder and nearer. Something was making its way towards the vehicle. I had to rub my eyes because I didn't believe what I was looking at. This creature, because it was not a man, stood about 7 feet and had brown scaly skin. The face and head were shaped like a human with a flat nose, but there were no ears or hair. The top of the head had a slight scaly ray or ridge that extended down the back of the neck. From what I could see, it had lips and regular-sized eyes. The arms were very long and muscular with human-like hands. It also had a massive 4 or 5 foot tail that tapered to a point. It was dressed in a gold metallic outfit with long pants and shoes. It also carried an oval pack attached to its back. I watched as this thing was looking at something on the vehicle. I had a high-speed camera which I used to document my cave explorations. I was able to obtain a few distorted images of the being. For some reason, while I was taking photos, the creature stopped and turned, looking in my direction. I'm not sure if it heard me, but it definitely knew of my presence. It then made a terrible hissing sound as it continued to look in my direction. That was enough for me. I quickly started making a beeline out of the cave. When I reached the entrance, I was shaking and hyperventilating. I finally reached my vehicle and drove home. I continued to explore caves in the area. I have heard stories of people encountering strange underground beings, but I have never disclosed my experience. A few years after my experience, I went back to the cave but was unable to get near it since the area is now government property. I can assume that I witnessed something that I was not supposed to see. It pains me to think what secrets are being kept from us. To those who say that there are no non-humans living among us, well, think again. They are here.
We used to go to Bloomington all the time when I was a kid. We would go to camp and hike at a place out on Eller Road near what is now Bent Arrow Archery Supply. I love Bloomington, and it is very rich in local folklore about haunted spots. I used to have a book on the areas of hauntings. I wish I still had it. Anyway, I am 35 and my family started going camping, hiking, and caving almost every weekend. We got to know a lot of locals who were always friendly. Unlike here in Hamilton, Ohio, and everybody had a this or that as a haunted story. A couple of the guys were on a special cave rescue team that the Bloomington Fire Department hasn't told us about the deaths that had happened in some of the caves. Most were drownings. Flash floods in the caves up there are nothing to screw around about. Every caver would follow the weather very closely, and if any chance of rain was possible, it was a no-go period. But the one story that got me was of a cave near Eller Road called Salamander Cave. It is very dangerous for flooding, especially the entrance, because it's basically a 400-yard long tunnel. Once you are in the middle, you won't have time to get out before you drown. Well, that's exactly what happened to 3 guys. They had turned and tried to make it out and drowned about 25 yards from the entrance. But the creepy thing is that when they went to recover the bodies, one guy had jammed his head into a crevice in the ceiling of the cave. He had jammed his head up there so tight in a last-ditch effort to escape the floodwaters that they found him hanging from the cave ceiling and had to chip the rock away to remove his body. And every time we would do that cave, you had to pass under that spot, and as a kid it freaked me out.
This incident took place in about 1993 in Limrock, Alabama. There were, I think, 6 of us in our group. Cave entrances in the southeast are usually formed at the contact between the sandstone cap and the limestone layer beneath it, so we normally hike in from the bottom of the mountain, then contour around the hillsides at the sandstone-limestone contact until we reach the cave. On this particular trip, the cove was fairly remote, and there wasn't good access to the hillside from the bottom, so we'd gone in from the top, leaving our trucks off a road on the ridge line. We'd only just begun contouring around the hillside when we found 2 oddities. A sapling, 9 inches in circumference, we measured it, that was broken 6 feet up the trunk. The top part of the sapling had been twisted around 360 degrees and the top was pointing downhill. The break was so fresh the wood was greenish and looked wet with sap. About 10 feet directly uphill was a little TP, about 14 inches tall, made out of sticks. So many sticks had been used that the walls were nearly solid. We stopped and considered these oddities for a bit. Opinions of their origin ranged from a Bigfoot did it, my opinion, to a crazy wind vortex that didn't move anything else near the sapling, including the leaves beneath it, and maybe a little kid was miles from the nearest home and decided to make a doll-sized teepee in the woods. We also noticed that there were large areas in which every sapling and bush was arched over with the arches all pointing downhill. This is also associated with Bigfoot, but there were so many of them that I suspect it was something more along the lines of wind and ice, or a really, really obsessive-compulsive Bigfoot. As we hiked, we began to hear wood knocking pacing us. If you've never heard it, it sounds like an axe hitting a tree. It was always 2 knocks, always about 100 feet uphill of us. About every 5 minutes, we'd hear the crack, crash, and thump of a tree falling just on the other side of the ridge line, always directly uphill from us. It's not uncommon for us to hear the sound of wood knocking. Always 2 above us, sometimes, on other trips, 3 knocks would answer the 2 from across a cove or down a hillside, and tree crashing pacing us when we hiked to caves. I remember once hearing it on 3 different hillsides in one weekend. It's always directly uphill from us, keeping pace with us. Anyway, as I said, we heard it pretty frequently, so, as always, we ignored it and continued hiking. All was fine until one of the guys in the group shoved over a dead, rotted tree stump, about 8 feet tall. Within seconds of the dead tree hitting the ground, it sounded like all hell breaking loose up above us on the hillside as trees started falling one after another after another. For the next 5 minutes it was a continuous crack, crash, boom, crack, crash, boom. We stood there, stunned. Even the Bigfoot non-believers had fear in their eyes, and we nervously acknowledged to one another that we had seriously ticked off something up there. We decided we'd better get moving, and hiked at a much more rapid pace to the cave. For the rest of the hike, we were pelted with dirt and pebbles and occasionally smallish rocks. The cave had a pit entrance, and I've never been so worried that something was going to mess with our ropes. Upon exiting the cave about 5 hours later, we found our ropes and the gear we'd left outside the cave untouched. We didn't hear anything unusual on the hike back to the trucks, but then, we never hear this stuff hiking back to the vehicles. We only hear it hiking to the caves. I think the knocking is a sentinel signaling to the other Bigfoot the location of strangers. The tree crashing is almost certainly a threat display. I've often wondered why we hear the knocking and tree crashing so often on caving trips and rarely on other types of hikes. I suspect part of it is that we aren't armed, so they don't feel they need to hide as completely. Also, my group always hiked unusually fast, and a group of people with ropes and packs marching purposefully through their territory might be cause to alert the rest of their group. The knocking always comes from above us on the hillside, and I think it makes them cranky if we surprise them by hiking in from above. In both this incident and the one where something threw large rocks at us and followed us, bellowing, into a cave, we had hiked in from above instead of hiking up the mountain from the bottom.
Go splunking. The cave is really nice, on a mountain, with some water flowing inside it, with a lake inside. The cave is also known in local folklore to have been inhabited by 3 sister witches. Witches used to be nice, but then one of them got killed, and the other 2 got angry and now they hate people. So I'm in this cave, with a guide telling this story. We kept splunking for a while. After some time, we hear the most horrible and inhuman scream. It starts low and increases in volume until it is painful for our ears. We ran out of the cave and away from the mountain, talking with locals to understand what happened. In the cave there's a siphon with water inside. Sometimes air passes in the siphon pushing water away, creating the horrible sound. It usually happens before a flood and we were lucky to have run away instead of drowning in the cave.
Before I went to the army and moved to the city afterwards, I lived in this small town in the middle of woods near nothing. Basically a place that once prospered, but eventually people just left, leaving behind lots of empty buildings and inbred families stalking the woods. Factor in the forest and the old World War II bunker network under the place, and you had a sight for a lot of creepy things for local youths to experience. One incident stuck to mind, however, mostly because it was hilarious and almost probably got me killed. Be me, around 14 or 15 or so, walking home from a friend's house late at evening. We lived pretty close to each other, so parents didn't mind. Still, pretty close to the countryside meant almost 4 miles of walking. A cool, chilly autumn evening, which meant that it was dark. No streetlights, barely any stars peeking through clouds, just the moon and lights of random houses in the distance. Anyways, I was walking past this large meadow that I needed to circle around to get home. Was the land of this violent old coot who later turned out to have buried 3 wives in that soil, so there was no way anyone was going to cut across the meadow. Which was why it was so odd to see people there, standing in a circle. Not being a total idiot, I crouched in a ditch that ran alongside the road and took a look at who the hell was out this late on a random meadow. As it turned out, it was a cult. A cult in bumfuck nowhere. Big dark robes, heavy hoods and everything. Would have thought it corny if I wasn't pissing my pants. I had seen enough weird stuff in the town already to know local nut jobs attacking teenagers wasn't anything new, especially if they were part of a cult. So I just hid there, trying to see if they were about to sacrifice some poor sod or something. As it turned out, no blood rituals for these guys tonight, just the ominous low chanting in a moonlight meadow while standing in a circle. This went on for minutes. Minutes during which I was stuck because I feared that if I rose up, they'd notice me. Frankly, I didn't want to test my speed against adults crazy enough to form a cult. So stuck I was, staring at whatever was coming at the end of the slowly building chant. Higher and higher, louder and louder it went. It was getting loud enough that I was surprised the old coot who owned the land hadn't woken up in his nearby house. However, at the point I thought they must be reaching the end, something happened. Something that made me burst out laughing. One of the sleeping cows in the meadow had decided enough was enough, and it was time to check out who were these crazy humans chanting in her field. So she barged into the circle like she was the goddamn cult leader and started sniffing the people and munching on their robes. Thus, I was treated with an image forever burnt in my memory. 10 or so oh-so-scary cultists shuffling around awkwardly as a cow tries to befriend them. So yeah, I started laughing, out loud, both out of released tension and of the absurdity of it. This, of course, meant that the cultists saw me and I had to make a hasty retreat. Luckily, the cow was on my side that night. Large farm animals do not like it when you start screaming and shouting and making sudden moves near them. So she decided to kick this one cultist who fell like a sack of potatoes. Used this chance to get the hell out of Dodge, sprinting down the dirt road while the cultists tried to rescue their buddy from the wrath of Daisy. When I got home, I spent the remaining eve hiding in the bathroom, hoping nobody had followed nobody had, and I went unsacrificed, though it wasn't the last time I saw these jackasses. Once got in trouble while drinking out in the woods, and once saw them while spelunking in the abandoned bunkers. Neither times were as memorable, though. Still, it was hard to take those idiots seriously after they were defeated by a cow.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.